The committee meets today to receive testimony of the Department of Defense fiscal year 2021 budget request. I welcome our witnesses and thank them for their service, both Dr. Mark Esper and General Mark. We got a pair of Marks this morning. This committee's top priority is ensuring the effectiveness and implementation of the National Defense Strategy. That's our book that we had been adhering to for a long period of time now, about 3 years. Unfortunately, under the last administration, we asked our military to do more with less, and that got us into trouble. Between 2012 and 2017, we lost $150 billion to sequestration. Our defense budget and the readiness of our forces were devastated. I think we all understand that. As a result, when President Trump came to office, he inherited an American military in crisis. Thankfully, he delivered on his promise to begin rebuilding the U.S. Armed Forces. Last year, President Trump negotiated the highest level of defense spending ever, a down payment toward getting our military back to where it needs to be. But that's not enough. We face a more dangerous world today than we anticipated we would. Since then, the Russian has invaded Crimea, backed Assad in Syria, sent mercenaries to Libya, and violated the INF Treaty. China began building islands in the South China Sea, harassing its neighbors more frequently and accelerating its military and nuclear modernization. The Bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission report said if we're going to adequately fund the National Defense Strategy and take on these threats, it's going to take a 3 to 5% increase, net increase above inflation each year. Now, we're not doing that. That's what we committed to. We had a meeting here. Everyone adheres to the logic of this contract that we agreed to, but we're not carrying through with it. That should mean a budget request would have been, if we had adhered to that, $775 to $790 billion this year. Instead, we've got a budget agreement that provides $740.5 billion for all that we've got to do for our military defense. And that's not your fault, not you guys, but Congress needs to do more, be more realistic about what it's going to take to maintain a force capable of deterring and, if needed, defeating our enemies. We're trying to do more while spending less, and the math just doesn't work that way. That's why you've seen so many stories about how we can't buy necessary equipment. That's why we can't do the training that we need to do. That's why we can't give our troops the tools that they need to keep the peace. It's all in the NDS. We can pay them now, or we can pay them later, and leave when our children, leave the debt to our children and grandchildren to pay, and they'll be doing it so in the more dangerous world if we don't fix the budget tragedy that we're facing right now. I know you've tried to do the best you can within the limits of what you've been given, and I appreciate that you already have found a lot of savings, and you are to be applauded for that. That's hard to do with the decreasing budget which we have today. On that happy note, I look forward to continuing to work with you to make sure our troops have the resources they need to fight and win. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me join you in welcoming our witnesses today. Thank them for their service to the nation, and I look forward to their testimony. Before we consider the details of the budget requests, I'd like to address some broader concerns I have with the department. The National Defense Strategy Commission report released in November 2018 expressed significant concern about the balance of power between civilian and military leadership at the Department of Defense. Specifically, the Commission report stated, civilian voices have been relatively muted on issues at the center of U.S. defense and national security policy, undermining the concept of civilian control. Unfortunately, the situation has only gotten worse since the Commission issued its report. The Office of the Secretary of Defense is without Senate-confirmed leadership in many of its most important positions. In the Policy Office, of the 7 positions requiring Senate confirmation, there are only 2 confirmed individuals, and one of these is now serving as the acting Undersecretary. We just received a nomination for Undersecretary of Personnel and Readiness after a 2-year vacancy. Then on Monday, the administration withdrew the nomination of Elaine McCusker to be the department's controller. These vacancies continue to challenge the department's ability to effectively respond to national security challenges and undermine civilian input into the decision-making process. With political appointees largely absent, a large amount of work in the department is now being done by career civil servants, and they too are beleaguered. Congress shares the blame in adding to civilian workforce woes with headquarters cuts. However, pay freezes, hiring freezes, exemption from collective bargaining, and having career civil servants carry the weight of defending political decisions is likely to lead to a hollowing out of the workforce whose experience and expertise we desperately need. Furthermore, October 23rd of last year, not this year, I joined Chairman Inhofe and our House counterparts in sending you, Mr. Secretary, a letter expressing concern about the department's failure to properly empower and staff the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict in order to fully exercise its congressionally mandated responsibilities for oversight and advocacy of Special Operations forces. This is another position that has had an acting principal for more than half the administration, and it's unacceptable, frankly, that we still haven't received a response to our letter more than 4 months later. Now, turning to the budget request before us, the fiscal year 2021 budget for the Department of Defense seeks $636.4 billion for the base budget and $69 billion in overseas contingency operations funds, of which $16 billion is designated to pay for base requirements. In its base budget request, the Defense Department highlights resources targeted for the modernization of a more lethal force that is prepared for a high-end fight against near-peer competitors and to operationalize the national defense strategy, including investments in the space and cyber domains, the recapitalization of our nuclear deterrent, and the largest ever research and development budget for artificial intelligence, directed energy, and hypersonic weapons. The base budget request also supports the quality of life of our service members by sustaining family support initiatives and by authorizing a 3% pay raise. However, it is clear that the base budget request will not cover all the Defense Department's requirements. So once again, we have been presented with an overly generous use of the OCO account. I acknowledge that both Congress and other administrations have included elements of base funding in OCO accounts in the past, but overloading the OCO request with $16 billion worth of activities that truly belong in the base budget is difficult to justify. I would also highlight that this year's budget reflects the outcomes of the Secretary's defense-wide review. The Department submitted a report to Congress in January that stated, in an era of flattening budgets, it is more important than ever that we find creative ways to fund NDS-driven activities. The review identified more than $5 billion in savings from defense-wide programs that were deemed a lower priority or inconsistent with the priorities of the NDS. Ms. Secretary, let me commend you for taking this review on. It's a tough job, and you did it thoroughly, and you did it with quite a bit of energy. Now, these savings will be taken, however, from, among other things, health affairs, DoD schools, and cooperative threat reduction programs. So I'm interested in hearing more about the analysis behind the programs that were cut or eliminated and the areas in which these resources were reinvested. Scrutinizing current programs to determine which ones support the Department's priorities and which ones should be reduced or eliminated is appropriate and necessary, and again, I commend you. However, it is somewhat disingenuous to argue that flat defense budgets have forced the Department to realign funds internally to support NDS implementation when the Department is making affirmative decisions to divert funding from NDS priorities. For example, the Department recently approved the transfer of $3.8 billion from National Guard equipment, additional combat aircraft, ISR assets, and amphibious ships in order to pay for the President's border wall. In addition, the budget request before us proposes significant cuts to initiatives like the European Defense Initiative. This is after funding for several military construction projects in EDI was taken out last year to again pay for the wall. Our close bond with our European allies and partners is one of our greatest strategic advantages and key to countering the near-peer competition of Russia. However, the cut to EDI sends exactly the wrong message to our allies and our adversaries. It is the responsibility of this committee to ensure the men and women we send into harm's way have the resources necessary to complete their mission and return home safely. And I'm proud that this committee, under the Chairman's leadership, has always worked in a bipartisan fashion during this process, and I look forward to working with all the committee members to come to a reasonable agreement again this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reed. We'll now have opening statements from Secretary Esper and General Milley. Your entire statement will be made a part of the record, and you are recognized.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of this committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2021. I'm joined today by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. The 2018 National Defense Strategy provides a clear roadmap for the Department of Defense to address the reemergence of long-term strategic competition from near-peer competitors China, then Russia. Throughout the Pentagon and across the Joint Force, the NDS guides our decisions and actions as we adapt the force to simultaneously contend with the threats of today while preparing for the challenges of tomorrow. We do this by increasing the readiness and lethality of our warfighters, strengthening our alliances and partnerships, and reforming the way the Department does business. Additionally, we have placed renewed emphasis on taking care of our service members and their families. The Department is grateful for the strong support provided in the FY20 NDAA and DoD appropriations, which allowed us to make vital investments in our military's modernization, enabled the creation of the Space Force, and provide our service members with the largest pay increase in a decade. Our continued success is contingent upon predictable, adequate, sustained, and timely funding, and I encourage Congress to pass a full-year spending package for all FY21 on time to avoid the debilitating effects of another continuing resolution. The Department's total FY21 budget request is $705.4 billion. This represents a minor increase from FY20 enacted amount of $704.6 billion, but does not keep pace with inflation. Given this flattened funding level, we were required to make many tough decisions to ensure our highest priorities were adequately funded. To enable our decision-making, we conducted a comprehensive defense-wide review aimed at reallocating resources from programs and activities that offer low return on investment relative to the goals and objectives of the NDS. Over a 4-month period, we conducted over 20 review sessions examining almost $100 billion in programs, agencies, and activities that make up the Fourth Estate. This review generated $5.7 billion in FY21 savings that were reinvested back into readiness and lethality efforts. Each of the military services is also instituting a similar review process across their budgets to achieve the same outcome of realigning resources and finding savings that can be reinvested into higher priorities. Additionally, I have initiated the process of conducting full reviews of all combatant commands to properly align our global military posture to the NDS. This effort will enable the Department to shift greater emphasis to our highest priority region, the Indo-Pacific, or allow us to return troops home to build readiness. Thus far, we have ongoing reviews of AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM and will expand to other commands over the coming months. My recent decision to deploy elements of an Army Security Force Assistance Brigade to Africa to replace units from an infantry brigade combat team is an example of how this process is enabling us to better match resources to the mission of each combatant command. The Department's FY21 budget request reflects the same disciplined adherence to the NDS. To preserve our overmatch, we have made significant investments into several critical technologies that will alter the future battlefield. Our RDT&E budget is the largest in our history and prioritizes hypersonics, microelectronics, 5G communications, autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence. We are moving forward with a long overdue recapitalization of the nation's nuclear triad, with key investments in the ground-based strategic deterrent, the B-21 stealth bomber, the Columbia-class submarine, and improved nuclear command, control, and communication systems, to name a few. We are also enhancing our missile defense capabilities to protect against the growing threat of advanced enemy missile systems. This budget request expands our capacity to defend our interests in space as we consolidate much of our space enterprise into the Space Force. It also advances the Department's cyber capabilities, allowing us to protect our digital infrastructure while disrupting covert foreign malign activity. This includes defending the integrity of our democracy by assisting in the security of our elections. Finally, in the traditional air, land, and sea domains, we are focused on modernizing our formations by divesting from platforms and equipment that are no longer suited for the emerging strategic environment. The Department appreciates this committee's advocacy of the National Defense Strategy, and we value Congress's guidance on reform. I now ask for your support so that we may fully implement our decisions and move forward with the investments needed to ensure America's military maintains our competitive advantage, continues to deter war, and preserves our nation's security. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Esper. General Milley.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Esper here today. It's my distinct honor and privilege to represent the almost 3 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of the United States Armed Forces, the best trained, best equipped, and best led military force in the world, and it would not be possible without your continued support. This budget is a strategy-driven budget. It is driven by the NDS, which you are fully aware of, and I fully support.
Yeah.
We stand ready and capable to deter war, defend our homeland from attack, support our allies, and if deterrence fails, we are fully capable today to fight and win our nation's wars against any potential adversary anywhere on the Earth's surface at any time. But our competitive advantage has eroded, and no one should have any doubt about that. China and Russia are increasing their military capabilities to outmatch the United States and its allies in order to exert their global influence. And China's objective is to do that by mid-century. North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations fuel regional instability and pose direct threats to partner nations and U.S. citizens. And while the nature of war is constant, advanced technologies have stressed our industrial age capabilities, concepts, and processes, and the changing character of war is happening in a very, very fundamental way. Additionally, we are recovering from readiness shortfalls and modernization deferments from 20 years of continuous warfare and a decade of fiscal instability. This year's budget builds on previous readiness and modernization gains, and I believe the FY21 budget submission is the best allocation of resource in a balanced way to support the National Defense Strategy. It builds a more lethal force, it strengthens allies and partners, and it reforms the Department for greater performance and affordability. It also prioritizes, as the Secretary said, the Indo-Pacific region to deter Chinese aggression, maintain stability, and ensure access to common domains in order to preserve a free and open international system, for which my parents fought for in the Second World War. It continues in Europe to counter Russian aggression, and it will continue to allow the United States military, in concert with our allies and partners, to deter provocative North Korea and Iran from aggressive action in their regions. And all the while, it provides money to continue our counterterrorist operations in various parts of the world. In short, PB-21 supports a ready, agile, and capable joint force that can compete, deter, and win across all domains today and in the future, and it targets specific investments in readiness, modernization, leader development, support to our people and their families. It invests in our readiness recovery that was built over the last 3 years. With this committee's support, all the services are scheduled to meet their readiness recovery goals in this FYDP. It funds modernization for great power competition across all warfighting domains, and it improves the safety, security, and reliability of our very critical nuclear enterprise. It invests in and stands up the Space Force and increases resiliency, deterrence capability, and warfighting options in both space and cyberspace. It funds joint all-domain command and control to improve our interoperability across all the services and with our allies. And it invests in the advanced technologies that the Secretary mentioned to address the more complex threats and the faster pace as the character of war changes. This budget also invests in our most valuable asset. The most valuable asset of the United States military is our people. It also funds the facilities, infrastructure, family support, and quality of life programs in a balanced way. And it invests in education and talent management in order to develop our junior leaders with the values and intellectual agility to fight and win future conflicts. The lieutenants and ensigns of today will be the generals and admirals of tomorrow. Ultimately, our military needs sustained, predictable, adequate, and timely funding to retain its competitive advantage in this era of great power competition, with the understanding that we must be good stewards of the resources entrusted to us by the American people and by Congress. I want to thank this committee for your continued support to all of our military, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, General Milley. Because of a scheduling problem, we'll begin our questions with Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your consideration. I have to go preside over the Senate in 10 minutes, known as presiding officer duty, which Lieutenant Esper and Lieutenant Milley could relate to staff duty back in their days. It's a duty, not an honor, and only the most junior personnel get to pull it. Secretary Esper, I want to commend your remarks at the Munich Security Conference about the threat that Huawei poses to the United States and our NATO allies. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like all of our NATO allies got the message or agree with it. Could you talk about the threat that Huawei's presence in Europe, especially in nations where we have troop presence, threatens our security and NATO security?
Yes, Senator, since my first NATO defense ministerial in June of last year, so I've been to 3 or 4 now, I've had a common message, one of many, and this is the threat that Huawei technology imposes on our networks. And the message has been that if countries, if our NATO allies incorporate Huawei technology, it may very well have a severe impact on our ability to share information, to share intelligence, to share operational plans, and for the alliance to conduct itself as an alliance. The fact of the matter is some countries get it, many more don't. It's a continual process where we're trying to work, and I think we also need to work together, some countries, on alternatives to Huawei, because otherwise we will find the alliance compromised in due course.
Should some of our allies in Europe move forward with Huawei and their networks, will we have to at least consider our force posture in those countries, given what it means for the security and privacy of our troops and their families?
I think, Senator, depending on how they move forward, we're going to have to assess what they've done and how they've done it and make an assessment for each country, and then from there decide what we're going to do with regard to those things I mentioned, information sharing, intelligence sharing, and so forth.
Okay. Last month, there were media reports that the Department of Defense had reservations about a regulation related to Huawei. The Commerce Department has proposed that regulation has now moved forward with none of those objections. Could you just make clear for us and maybe all the people that work for you directly what the Secretary's position is on Huawei?
Well, I'm very concerned about Huawei and other Chinese technologies, so I think we need to take a very careful eye with regard to our export controls, Chinese technology in general, Huawei specifically, and I think we need to be very conscious of Chinese technology in our system. By the same token, I need to balance the equation, make sure we understand our own technology companies and ensuring that we have access to that as well. But overall, I'm very concerned about Chinese technology, espionage, cyber theft, you name it, that's ongoing and has been for many years in our country.
Thank you. On the topic of espionage, let's turn to Russia and specifically the Open Skies Treaty and how they use that and how they cheat on it in their own country, specifically refusing to allow us to fly Open Skies flights over Kaliningrad, their strategically located enclave in Europe, and also around and near Georgia. Other witnesses in the past in front of this committee, like General Dunford, General Milley's predecessor, Vince Stewart, former head of DIA, have testified that Russia has been cheating on the Open Skies Treaty, that we don't get much benefit out of it as long as they're cheating, that even called it a relic of the past. Do you think that the Open Skies Treaty still serves United States interests, given the fact that Russia continually cheats on that treaty?
Senator, they have been cheating for many years. I raised this at the Defense Ministerial last month with all of our NATO partners that we need to speak out more clearly about Russian noncompliance. You mentioned Georgia and Kaliningrad. Those are two good examples. We've also been denied access to military exercise overflights. There are some other issues that we cannot discuss in this session, which we should come and talk to you about. But I have a lot of concerns about the treaty as it stands now.
So I noted that the President's budget did not include money to recapitalize the Open Skies Treaty aircrafts, the OC-135s, but I've also heard that there may be, as early as next month, the possibility of contracts announced to modernize those aircraft. What can you tell us about that use of funds?
At this point in time, until we make a final decision on the path forward, I'm not prepared to recapitalize aircraft. I want to make sure we understand what the direction is. I would note that many of our allies that are in the Open Skies Treaty, and I've talked to them a lot, this is important to many of our NATO allies, that they have the means to conduct the overflights. We still have the means to conduct overflights. I was at Offutt Air Force Base just last week. I had a chance to walk about one of the OC-135s and talk to the crew and take a look at the aircraft. But at this point in time, we're holding until we get better direction.
Good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. And, Mr. Secretary, let me return to some of my comments in the open statement about the vacancies in the department. There are two significant issues. One is I highlight civilian control of the military, which you need civilians to do that, and also institutional capacity. People who've been on the job have the credibility and the legitimacy of being confirmed and are not acting. Can you tell us why we have so many unfilled positions and acting personnel Speaking for the chairman, I think has done a remarkable job of getting people through when they get up here. So could you comment?
Yes, Senator. Let me first give you a rundown on the numbers. So of 60 confirmed slots, it was 58 until the NDAA was passed. We added 2 new space positions. So of 58, 39 are currently filled. We have 2 nominees waiting on the floor for a vote. We have 4 nominees in committee. We have 2 intents to nominate. We have 4 more that are right behind them. And then we have 5 more in the process. So of the balance, I think that's 6 in the balance that we have to identify positions for. Now, as you know, many of us have been in this town a long time. It becomes more challenging as you get into the 4th year of a first term in terms of finding people, and that is a challenge. And we have also have challenges with moving people through the process. These are long processes. With regard to where we are, I don't think the situation is as dire as some may think. We have very capable people in the positions. I've gotten the chance to work with them both in the current role and my previous role as Secretary of the Army, and we have very capable DOD civilians, career civilians, who also help out. At no time have I had any concerns about civilian control of the military, to be frank. I know that's part of the NDS review. When I came in my first week or 2 on the job, I instituted a number of changes where the uniform and civilian leadership works together, sits together in weekly meetings. We together review our national defense strategy implementation. We together review op plan implementation or development. And we have a much better integration today between civilians and military than we did, I think, 9 months ago.
In regard to the nominations that are coming up to us, I don't think I'm alone when I was surprised that Elaine McCuskey's nomination was withdrawn. From everything I've heard, she's a very capable and experienced individual. In fact, that's why she was nominated in the first place. To your knowledge, can you tell us why her nomination was withdrawn?
Well, Elaine is a very capable and dedicated public servant, but the President has the right to choose his members who he's going to nominate.
So it was a presidential decision, not a recommendation by you or anyone else in the Department of Defense?
Well, it was a PPO decision at this point. I don't have any more fidelity at this juncture.
Well, again, I think one of the concerns we go back to is that your role as Secretary of Defense, you should have a critical voice in all these nominations. That goes with the territory.
Sure.
And you should have it. And if you didn't have it in this case, I think that is a problem, which I hope we can address. The other area I spoke in my opening remarks was a SOLIC position. And you realize that over several years, through several NDAAs, we've tried to build up the capacity of the SOLIC to be a secretary-like individual. And again, we have someone who's an acting position. That's been since last June when Secretary West retired. So can you promptly provide a committee with a plan for implementing, not just getting a person in place, but making that person act like a service secretary?
Yes, Senator. First of all, thanks again. I think you brought this up a month ago when we sat down together, and I was not tracking it. That's on me. I have a high regard for SOLIC. Believe it or not, I worked as an IMA reservist in SOLIC many, many years ago. But since then, we've taken a number of actions. So we're pushing forward on the nominee. We are looking at we are going to reconsolidate SOLIC back in the Pentagon. I've tasked the SOLIC to provide a number of recommendations on Section 922 implementation. We will begin frequent meetings between the SOLIC and myself and/or the deputy on a routine basis. So we're and then also committed to recruiting and retaining more talent in SOLIC. So I think we're taking a number of steps to integrate SOLIC and to achieve what was in law that you talked about.
Thank you.
And I look forward to updating you on this as we go forward.
Thank you. Just a different topic here, but due to exceptional staff work on both the majority and minority side, we discovered about 2 years ago that many of our allies were not paying for fuel, the Saudis and Emiratis, for example. It was about a $300 million bill. The Emiratis, when confronted with it, paid up. The Saudis are still paying. But just today, the GAO has released a report indicating that the department has failed to secure reimbursement for more than $1 billion worth of support to other nations. I have no time left, but can you briefly, very briefly, comment and also indicate what you're going to do to collect the money, basically?
Yes, sir. I've tried to track that number down. I can't find the billion-dollar number. I am tracking that with regard to payments. They are caught up at this time. They've reimbursed us for approximately $113 million. There is still approximately $38 million outstanding in flying costs. But I want to pull the thread a little bit more on that billion-dollar number to make sure I'm not missing something, and that GAO report is helpful.
Thank you.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and General Milley, there's been a lot of reporting about the reduction in funding for the Virginia-class submarine in connection with the NNSA's budget increase. Critics of nuclear modernization are equating concern for the Navy's shipbuilding plan with opposition to funding the NNSA and are using some recent comments made by Acting Secretary Modly and also you, General Milley, to suggest that DOD does not support the current budget request for NNSA. Now, I share the concern for the Navy's shipbuilding budget, and Congress will have an opportunity to look at that. But I know that you are both very strong supporters of nuclear modernization. And also, Admiral Richard was before this committee when he was here several weeks ago testifying that there was no excess margin in the NNSA's budget. So I just want to be clear on this. Do you both support the requested level of funding for nuclear modernization at the NNSA?
Senator, I do, and if you don't mind, I'll give a little bit explanation. I think it's vitally critical that we recapitalize our nuclear triad. That's why we placed that as #1 defense priority in terms of our funding. That means not just the platforms, the B-21, the ground-based strategic deterrent, and the Columbia-class submarine, but also nuclear command control and a few other things like long-range strike. But you also have to have the packages, the warheads, et cetera, the plutonium pits to go with that. So it's critical that those be funded and moved quickly forward so we can have them paired up in time to recapitalize and ensure that the strategic deterrent is modern by the year, beginning in the year 2030.
And there's no room for pausing the production?
There is no room for margin. I've been working with our folks at OSD and Admiral Richard to try and actually build margin into our current fleet so that we have some room. But it's critical that we meet that timeline.
Okay. General Milley?
And I absolutely support fully funding the nuclear enterprise. I absolutely support fully funding the nuclear enterprise. It's the #1 priority. It's kept the peace, world peace, actually, from great power war for going on 7.5 decades. So I absolutely support that. I think what we're talking about is the Hask's testimony from last week. I was not involved in the decision to move the money from the SSN, but I fully support fully funding our nuclear enterprise.
Thank you. I think it's important that the record reflect that. Mr. Secretary, Section 1039 of the 2013 NDAA requires the Nuclear Weapons Council to certify NNSA's budget and ensure it's adequate to meet requirements. Conferees clearly stated in the accompanying report their expectation that through this provision, the Nuclear Weapons Council will, quote, take an active role in shaping and reviewing the NNSA budget as it is prepared for submission to Congress and negotiated with the Office of Management and Budget during the budget review process, end quote. This year, the certification letter submitted pursuant to this provision read, quote, NNSA is unable to provide detailed budget information to support certification in advance of the budget release of the President's fiscal year 2021 budget request by the Office of Management and Budget. The NWC cannot perform the analysis required to produce a budget certification letter without this information, end quote. I think it's obvious that the process is not working. But what is your view of the situation, and how can we resolve this to ensure the intent of the provision is being met?
Senator, I completely agree. I think we need to let the Nuclear Weapons Council work. I think that looking at budgets needs to begin very, very early, arguably in the late summer of the year before. I would like to have a look at that as well. I want to make sure that we're prioritizing the right things so that we have a capable strategic deterrent. I think if that were the case, then we would have been in a much different situation. We've already got agreement from NNSA to do that and DOE, and I got agreement also from OMB to support us on that. So I think it's very important, and we intend to implement that going forward.
Thank you. As you stated earlier, this has to work together. It has to be on time in order to meet our #1 priority of the NDS. Also, Mr. Secretary, in the time since the budget was released, we've heard complaints, including many here in Congress, about things that either weren't included or were perceived to be underfunded in this budget. Ships, aerial refueling tankers, stars and stripes, rumors about a withdrawal from Africa, the European Deterrence Initiative, the list goes on and on. You've heard those. What's forgotten sometimes is that it is Congress that sets the funding level, not the administration. So, Mr. Secretary, is it fair to say that these trade-offs are the result of the lower top line that was approved by Congress?
They are, Senator. I would still scrub my budget really hard year after year regardless, because I think it's necessary to do defense-wide reviews. But as the chairman mentioned up front, we have to get back on the trajectory of 3 to 5% annual real growth if we're going to modernize the force and implement the NDS. I was shown a number a few days ago that if you go back to the Budget Control Act, I think it was August 2011, and the amount of funding we would have had if we hadn't gone that course, it's somewhere between $450 to $550 billion lost that we could have put into modernization. And so that's the catch-up we have to look at this point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here and for your service. Secretary Esper, I appreciate all of the comments that you've made about your efforts to find additional funding within your budget, given the constraints that you're looking at. But as you're aware, I'm sure last year the department realigned $6.1 billion for its budget towards constructing a border wall along the U.S. southern border with Mexico. And more recently, the administration is going to divert another $3.8 billion from the Pentagon toward the border wall. They're taking that from a number of programs, and as Senator Reid outlined in his opening statement, including 8 MQ-9 Reapers, which we heard from General Walters are very important as they're looking at ISR along the Eastern European border. So I guess explain to me how we can feel comfortable with raiding the defense budget at a time when you're telling us you have needs and are expecting a shortfall based on a flatter budget for 2021. Why should we assume, if you can divert that kind of money for the border wall, that we should give you additional funding to address other areas of need?
Senator, as you know, the southwest border was declared a national emergency by the president based on what has been happening down there.
And as I'm sure you know, the Congress actually voted that we did not agree with that designation, and in fact, it's only because the president vetoed it that didn't change. And I think there are some real questions about whether taking money that has been appropriated by the Congress, signed into law for another use, is actually legal and constitutional.
Yes, Senator, I understand. It's with the declaration of the national emergency, and we were asked to support the Department of Homeland Security. Border security is national security. With that is our understanding under the law that, as directed, we are able to transfer that money to support that, much like we do many other things, whether it's fighting wildfires or helping with floods, whatever the case may be. But I think the larger issues with regard to modernizing the force, we're talking about, making some big investments that are going to require a divestiture of things we've done in the past in order to invest in the things we need in the future. I think the demands there pale in comparison to what is being used to support DHS on the wall.
We had the acting Secretary of DHS before the Appropriations Subcommittee last week, and he showed us numbers that indicated there are significant dollars there for additional construction on a border wall that they are not likely to use in the next year. So it's hard for me to understand how we can justify taking money that we need from our military to construct a wall along the southern border. I'm not going to ask you to respond to that because I'm going to be running out of time. But I think it's a very real question, and I certainly hope that we won't see past this year any further effort to take money from our military, and I hope you will commit to that.
Senator, at this time, we don't foresee the need at this time to draw upon these sources next year. And I will follow up with the Secretary to find out, because we want to support DHS but not over-support DHS, if that makes sense.
I want to commend you on the day that you were sworn in, appointing a commission to deal with PFAS contamination. It is an issue for us in New Hampshire, as I know you're aware, as it is in so many other states. And I'm sure you know that the FY20 NDAA included a provision to phase out the use of fluorine-containing firefighting for military use by 2024. Can you give us an update on where the military is and finding an alternative?
Yes, ma'am. We're working that issue hard. It's to replacement. It's what the AFFF, I think. It's an acronym.
Right.
The three things we're focusing on is the replacement for that. Number two, making sure we're taking care of our people, and then the communities that they live in or near. And then number three, making sure we understand the health effects on humans from these foams. So the task force has been working very hard since I launched them, integrating well with EPA and other parts of the government. I hope to have a report come up here very soon, within a week or two, to update you on that and the progress we're making. And I know we have some hard marks to make in terms of replacing the current foam with a new mechanism. But we've been putting a lot of dollars into researching that. I want to say we went from $139 million last year to $200 million this year requested to tackle PFOS, PFOA.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your continued commitment. I think it's something that we all need to work on.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, first, let me begin by thanking you and your families for your decades of service. It is not unnoticed, and we most certainly appreciate what you have done. General Milley, I'd like to begin with you. Part of the discussion, and Senator Shaheen has started this discussion with regard to the resources that we have and the need for those resources. I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about modernization, but also I want to talk about readiness today. I want to preface it by simply sharing that over the last number of years, this committee has received reports about the challenges we have in readiness of our armed forces today. And the fact that over a period of years, and the fact, as you both alluded to, we've been at war for 20 years, and that takes its toll. When it comes to the equipment that our young men and women use, I'm just going to list them out, and I'd like to have you, if you could, give us an update. B-1s, May of last year, we had 6 of them that were actually operational. FA-18s, at one point, a little over a year ago, was reported at less than 40%, or at about 40%, were operational. F-15Cs, you were limited to about 2 Gs in terms of maneuvering, less than what a King Air would do in regular aviation. You've got approximately on F-22s, you've got perhaps 125 remaining that might be operational at a time, a percentage of those. With regard to your nuclear submarines, your attack submarines, you've got 4 of them right now that are at dock. I believe the Boise may be in dry dock now, but nonetheless, clearly we've got a shortfall there of nuclear attack submarines that are waiting for their half-life to begin. Along with that right now, I think you've got somewhere around 31 BCTs in the Army. I'd like to know, I think at one point we had as few as less than single digits, the numbers that were ready to fight tonight. General Milley, are we making progress? And can you give us an update just on these particular ones with regard to where we may have improved on those numbers over the last couple of years?
Well, thanks, Senator, for the opportunity. What I'd like to do, if I could, is get you the specific numbers on this card, but this card's classified. Actual readiness data by type weapon system with numbers that you're talking about is classified information. We don't want the enemy of our country to know all that, on the one hand. On the other hand, I can tell you that it has improved, and I would put it in the about a third or so as I look at these numbers, about a third improved over the numbers that you probably saw anywhere between 12 and 24 months ago. So there's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward in some of this stuff in terms of readiness, and we monitor it very, very closely every month. And it has improved, and I can get you the exact data if you allow me to do that in a classified way.
That's fine, sir, but I just want to make it clear, the numbers that I gave you, I received in a non-classified session, as a matter of fact, in open session just like this. So,
Okay.
But the reason for my point is not to be critical, but rather to point out how important it is that we have the resources available to you
Sure.
to continue to make those improvements. And
Readiness is our number one in terms of the amount of money that we're putting towards this budget and in past budgets. We're trying to radically improve the readiness of the force, the fight tonight sort of thing. And at the same time, you have to have balance for modernization for the changing character of war against those investments that the Secretary talked about earlier.
Well, and I think the fact that we're modernizing our nuclear weapon systems is probably absolutely,
Sure.
It is absolutely critical because right now, based upon our non-military capabilities,
Right.
They fear our military because of our nuclear capabilities as much as anything else.
There's no question about it, that the peace through strength is not just a bumper sticker. It matters in the whole idea of deterrence. And you have to have the capability and the will to use it, and your enemy's got to know that you have the capability and the will. So the capability is important, and that goes right into the readiness piece. And we want to make sure that our enemies know that we are ready. In my opening statement, I said we are ready. I don't expect you to take it on faith. I'd like to report out in a classified way exactly how ready by type system if I could.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator, if I may, what you're looking at is a trade-off between current readiness and future readiness. And Senator Fisher draw this out. I talk about the $450 to $550 billion of lost funding. That's really important when you're trying to recapitalize, whether it's the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine Corps, but particularly big capital projects like shipbuilding. If you don't have that funding, if it's not predictable and steady for the industrial base, they just can't. You just can't build what you do. So what you're doing is you know, it's like driving an old car. You reach the point where you're putting so much maintenance into the old car, you got to buy the new one, or else it's a losing battle.
No question, sir. And you're making the point that I think we want to have made, which is, and you can't do it without continued resources on an expected basis year to year. And I think you are making progress, and I was hoping to be able to share some of that progress, but to say, if given the appropriate resources, we are making improvements and will continue to. But I agree, it's readiness versus modernization in many, many cases, and that trade-off is tough to handle once in a while.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're all monitoring the coronavirus closely, and I appreciate the department taking this seriously and working to keep our service members and their families safe. And while in Hawaii we do not have any confirmed cases, we are a gateway for travelers from China, South Korea, Japan, so we must be exceptionally vigilant and coordinated. Mr. Secretary, will you commit to me that the DOD will act quickly on requests made by the state of Hawaii to assist with response in the event it is needed? I know there are some factors we have to meet pursuant to the National Response Framework and DOD Directive 3025.18.
Yes, ma'am. Under Title 10, of course, Title 32 would require action by the governor first.
Yes, I understand.
Okay.
That's my question. So, Mr. Secretary, you say in your posture statement that the Indo-Pacific remains DOD's #1 priority region. I have a series of questions about the threat in this region, and as I have only now 4 minutes left, I'd really appreciate your answers to be very brief, and a yes or no would be great. In your statement, you say North Korea is seeking to build legitimacy through the development of a variety of nuclear, conventional, and unconventional weapons, and by growing its ballistic missile capabilities. Is the threat of North Korea's ballistic missile capabilities becoming increasingly dangerous?
It's becoming increasingly complicated as they seek to modernize the full range of missile systems.
So I'd say that's a yes. You say in your posture statement that the FY21 budget request is directed toward achieving, and I quote, irreversible implementation of NDS, end quote, which includes enhancing missile defense capabilities pursuant to the 2019 Missile Defense Review. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, we are putting additional money into missile defense and defeat.
And do the North Korean long-range ballistic missiles pose a threat to the United States, which of course includes Hawaii?
Yes, if our intelligence is correct, they would.
Yes. And you also state your budget request, quote, increases missile defense capability and capacity to keep pace with adversary missile systems, end quote, while investing in a layered defense of the homeland. But, Mr. Secretary, in spite of 4 years of authorizations and 3 years of appropriations from Congress and your own 2019 Missile Defense Review, you have zeroed out the HDR Hawaii, which is a radar for Hawaii, which is part of a system that provides layered defense of the homeland. Is this decision to zero out the funding for HDRH a decision to not build this radar at all in Hawaii?
Not necessarily, Senator. As you know, for many years now, we've had a problem with state and local authorities giving us permission to get onto that site and do what we need to do, if I recall correctly. And it seemed the latest report we had at the time building the budget is we probably wouldn't see any resolution for another year or 2 or 3.
So does that mean that we can expect you to request, I'm very familiar with certain delays with regard to the siting. So does this mean that we can expect a request of money for the HDRH in fiscal year 22?
I think when we see a light at the end of the tunnel with regard to getting clearance to build, yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's good to know. And because otherwise the decision to zero out the HDRH and reprioritizing the funds from DOD's number one priority region, as you say, for another purpose really doesn't make sense. And I'd also like to have a commitment from you now that you will not seek to repurpose F-20 funding for this radar that is still being used to continue the HDRH Hawaii contract.
Senator, I'm not sure I can make that commitment because I'm not sure I fully understand what you're asking. But again, what we're trying to do is, in the era of tight budgets, make sure we don't put money against something that has no possibility of being affected in the near term.
Well, I don't know what you mean by the near term, because
Well, in the
this
upcoming
radar
fiscal year.
is part of a system and was supposed to be pretty much operational by 2023, which means that it's, aside from the delays that I understand that's occurred, we're supposed to be on track because that's what the National Defense Strategy calls for. So in 2020, there was some $188 million. This is being expended even as we speak. So I would like to know that you are not going to repurpose this funding that's already there
Well, Senator, if I
for
recall,
other purposes.
yes, ma'am. If I recall the issue properly, it's developing of the system is one thing, but if I develop a system and I can't put it somewhere that it has no effect, it's wasted money.
Well, you know that this contract is, as far as I know, Lockheed Martin is already building this radar. So there's already a contract for them. This thing was supposed to be, in fact, operational in 2023. So if we don't go ahead with this, I think that you're going to have some contractual things to deal with. But, you know, what I'm hearing from you is, aside from the delays that were caused by the sighting, mainly of this radar, that you have a commitment to pursue the radar and have it built in Hawaii as part of our system, missile defense system.
I'm making commitment to you that we, of course, intend to defend all 50 United States and territories with radars and effectors as necessary. What I need to come back to you with is a better understanding where things lie. It's one thing to build a radar, but if I invest hundreds of $millions in a radar and then I cannot place it somewhere, then it's wasted money.
Of course, I realize that. That's not what I'm asking. Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Ernst is recognized. Senator Fisher is presiding.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, very much for being with us this afternoon. There are a few things that I'm very interested in as the chair of emerging threats and capabilities, and of course, one of those is hypersonics. And Secretary Esper, if I could focus on that for a moment.
Excuse me.
A key component of our NDS is assessing and recalibrating our posture with regards, of course, to the great power competition. China has a leg up. We can't dispute that in developing technologies like hypersonic aircraft and missiles. And the technology could give users the tactical long-range capability to hit targets, yet with such speed and surprise that defending against them is very, very difficult. Great concern to all of us. So how is the DoD investing in deconflicting research priorities across the services? We have a lot of research going on out there to limit the duplicative spending on hypersonics.
Thank you, Senator. And first of all, you're correct. Hypersonics is one of our top priorities in terms of developing a capability, lethality in that field. We are doing very innovative work, and I would tell you it's more innovative than what you would see coming out of Russia or China. I can assure you of that.
Good.
We have maximized every dollar we put into this year. I think it's $3.2 billion, and over the FIDUP to make sure that we get inventory out in the field as soon as possible. Each of the services has a variety of programs. DARPA has programs as well. And through either collaboration between the services or through work through our R&E shop under Dr. Griffin, we're working very hard to make sure there's not duplication, but more importantly, sharing. And we see a lot of sharing between the services. So I'm very confident that in the next few years we'll be deploying hypersonic weapons as the commanders need them throughout the theater, but in the Indo-Pacific theater in particular.
Okay, just to be clear, you said it's $3.2 billion over FIDA?
No, ma'am, it's $3.2 billion this year.
This year, okay. And is that, you feel that that is sufficient?
I asked multiple times to make sure, is that every single dollar we can put against it and effectively use? In other words, there's no more, one more extra dollar would be a wasted dollar, and I was assured multiple times that that was the max we could put into that.
Okay, and thank you, Secretary. And how does this fit into our nuclear modernization efforts?
It certainly gives us, we're talking about conventional systems here. It gives us an incredible strike capability below the nuclear threshold, which is important to reach out at long ranges to strike somebody with precision at speeds of 5, 10 times the speed of sound with great capability. And it's going to give us a lot of reach, which is what we'll need in a conflict against a near peer.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I know that we're embracing innovation at every level possible, and I appreciate that within the DoD, and we're modernizing to give our warfighters that tactical advantage over our adversaries. And, of course, another area I'm interested in is quantum information systems technology, again, one of Mr. Griffin's areas. But we are exploring options for quantum integration in a variety of areas. However, we hear from various industry that DoD requirements are too broad for the current scope of research. And what the industry leaders are recommending is that the DoD refine their requirements, and this can help drive unified efforts to advance rapidly, first in a narrow area instead of slowly across a very large spectrum. Can you speak a little bit to some of the advances we're seeing in quantum information systems?
Yes, ma'am. Quantum definitely is a top priority. It's probably in the top tier, if you will. Dr. Griffin's very passionate about this. I'll have to go back and get you an answer. Typically what we ask of industry, though, is they ask us not to give them requirements per se, and they ask us to tell them the solution we're looking for, help us, tell them the problem we're trying to solve, and let them help us develop the solution. So this is a little bit different than what I typically hear. So I'd like to run this down and come back to you on
And
that.
certainly, we'd love to partner on that. It's just critical that in some of these areas that we see in emerging threats and capabilities, a lot of the discussions that we have, that we are very focused on advancing technology and working with industry partners, small businesses, and so forth in that area. But I do appreciate you both, gentlemen, very much for being here today, and look forward to working further with you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Senator Jones.
Thank you both for being here and for your service. I really appreciate your opportunity to come here. Secretary Esper, it would come as no surprise to folks here that I have been advocating Redstone Arsenal to be the head of Space Command. You and I have talked about that a good bit. And in May of 2019, before you were even the acting secretary, the list was winnowed down. There was a series of visits, an extensive process. It was winnowed down to a few sites. The Redstone Arsenal was a part of those. Space Command was supposed to be announced in the fall. It wasn't, and we're in March. It's still not. And then yesterday, Lieutenant General Thompson testified before the House Armed Services Committee that the Air Force had been directed, and I emphasize the word directed, to go back and open this up. He said, open up the aperture and look at all of them, including some non-traditional locations, and that they would establish the criteria, which I thought had already been established months, if not a couple of years ago, and that none of these, the list, Redstone Arsenal, others were on there. So, you know, a cynical person would, in today's world, think that there was some political electoral politics coming into this, because Congress has wanted to do this, and we've been supportive, but now we're going to get delayed again in opening this process up. So I have a series of questions. Number one, did this come from the White House? If so, who? If it didn't, or if it did, was there pushback? If not, if it came from you or others, tell me how that process came up to open this up again, because a lot of folks have been looking at this for a long time.
Yes, Senator, it came from me.
All right.
I'm the responsible party. During my talks on the Hill prior to my nomination, and more particularly after my hearing here, I visited the House, and I heard from members on both sides of the aisle that they felt that the process that had been run was unfair and not transparent, and there were a number of complaints. So I directed at that time we pause in place. I took a briefing on it along with Deputy Secretary Norquist, and we did not feel as well that it was transparent enough, that enough states, members, et cetera, had a chance to participate. So we directed it to be revisited and a different approach be taken, where they outlined the criteria, the screening criteria by which a place would meet as a qualifying material, that we would go out to all members and offer them to nominate locations, if you will. we'd screen from there, but do a very iterative, transparent thing where members can also comment on the criteria. We would update at various points in time, and then keep narrowing it down, much like we did on Futures Command, till you got to the final site, so that everybody had confidence that it was fair and there were no politics involved in it, and that it was the best site for the mission at hand. I regret to say that process began late. I had another revisit with them about a month ago, which is what probably prompted that testimony, but I'm the one that did it. It was my initiative, simply to make sure that there was transparency and buy-in and consent from members who were interested.
How long will the process take now?
It's going to take several months. I think I don't see anything being announced. If it helps assure you, I don't see anything being announced before the election.
All right. Fair enough.
And in fact, I would probably, regardless, I think it's best to keep it out of the election for the reasons that you cited.
All right, let me ask you about a concern that I think has been raised by a couple of folks here, and that is the transfer of funds to build the border wall. Taken out of that was $261 million out of Mobile, Alabama at Austell to build an EPF, which is, I think, a very, very important ship, and it was one that is in part of this transition. Austell, as you know, is the only shipbuilder that's delivering ships to the Navy on time and on budget. Was any consideration given to how that might impact folks like down in Mobile when these decisions were made? And the first part of that question, though, is I want to make sure I understood the reasons. The reasons for this part of the money is strictly for trying to close off drug smuggling. It has nothing to do with immigration, but drug smuggling. Is that correct?
It's under this authority, the 284 authority. It's directed at counter-drug, narco-trafficking routes, if you will, in support of DHS. That's the provision of law under which it falls.
All right.
And I'm sorry.
Talk to me about Austell.
Yes, sir. So what we tried to do in this process is to make sure that we could find, as best as possible, a way to look at the problem that was objective and apolitical, and that we could stand behind. And the staff came up with, as they looked at it, is the fact that the items that were either not requested in the FY20 budget or items that were early to need, either excess to need or early to need, was a very clean-cut line that did not take politics or anything like that into account, and was very objective, and that was the standard by which we went. I consulted with my service secretaries. The chairman consulted with the chiefs of staff, the joint chiefs, and that was the basis upon which we made the decision, recognizing fully that there are a lot of different players and equipment and things caught up in that, but that was the way we approached it.
All right. Well, I will say, I'm out of time, but I will have some questions for the record, including maybe a little bit more of an explanation on the Space Command, and also a report on the current conditions of facilities used by the Senior Reserve Officer Training Corps Minority Serving Institution, another on the commitment to the Junior ROTC Pilot Program, Scholarship Program that we're doing, and also...
Great program, by the way.
Thank you. And also review and report about the Department of Defense Child Development Center. So I'll have those for the questions for the record. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Secretary and General, for your service, for your appearance today. Special thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your recent trip to Minot, and please thank Leah as well. It was an exceptional day for the airmen and missileers in Minot, and I hope you took something away from it as well. And since we're on the topic, and since
I went there in the winter. So.
Well, the fact you came in February does add to your street cred, without a doubt. But you also got to see them at their best in the toughest conditions, working with some very old equipment, as you noticed, no doubt. Some very old airplanes, flown and maintained by some very young airmen, and some very old missiles maintained by some very young missileers. And so we appreciate the priority of modernization, obviously. And with regard to the missiles specifically, you know, ever since the GBSD has been on, you know, on the planning board, I've pressed pretty hard about the timeline, and particularly knowing there are detractors here and there, and of course the, you know, the lack of competitive RFP added to that. If you could just give an update on GBSD, the progress, and what you see, if any, challenges there might be, and what, you know, what risks we run if there is a delay.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, we continue to move forward on GBSD. It's vitally important as the land-based leg of the triad, as you know. What concerns me most is the same thing that I discussed with Senator Fisher, is we have no margin left with regard to the timeline. It's utterly important that we move out quickly. I share your concerns about lack of competition, so we're going to have to be very clever, and Undersecretary Lord is working out a number of ways by which we keep the pressure on the contractor to stick to cost and stick to performance and timeline to schedule associated with that, because there is no margin with regard to replacing that. We tend to have this recapitalization problem coming all together at around the same time. But that said, I'm also looking for ways to build margin in that leg of the triad. Are there different things we can do to extend it? And then, as you know, I have personal concern after speaking to folks there is make sure we maintain the health and vitality and readiness of the missile force itself. A very important mission and a very tough mission when you have a chance to get down one of those silos and experience what they go through.
It is that. General Milley, with regard to this, I think the Secretary referred to the divest of some of the things of the past to invest in things of the future. We hear a lot lately in this budget about the risk associated with getting from here to there, and the divestiture of some of those legacy systems. One of the things that comes up often, of course, is the ISR demands in the theater. I think pretty much every combatant commander I've talked to says we're woefully short, and yet some of the legacy systems that are being targeted for retirement to make room for modernization include some very important ISR assets. And I'd be interested in sort of your take on all that, if you're comfortable with for example, Global Hawk future, MQ-9, whether the risk is worth it or what the risk might even be.
Well, it depends on. You're off. Depends on what adversary or enemy you're talking about. So many of the ISR systems that we have today that are in very high demand are very, very useful against terrorists, insurgents, against fixed sites, et cetera. And they have clear penetration capability when there's no significant air defense threat or there's no other types of threats. If you're talking about great power competition, which is what this NDS talks about and what this budget is all about, that's a different type of ISR. So we're trying to divest ourselves of the ISR that is not particularly useful against a Russia or China or even high-dense air defense systems of an Iran or a North Korea, and invest in those ISR systems that do have penetration capability. And that's why you see some of the divest in order to invest. There's no need, it makes no sense to me to continue to buy stuff that isn't in alignment with the NDS. So it's a depends question on what your enemy is. With respect to the quantity or capacity relative to the COCOMs, you'll never find a combatant commander who has enough ISR. It's just not going to happen. We have been every single year in and year out, for 20 years, always been short of ISR. We continue to build it. You're never going to buy your way out of the problem because it has to do with information and having to do with knowledge and decision making. So we will always be chronically short of ISR. But the key, though, for the divest to invest is it depends on who you're going against. And we need to invest in the capabilities that are worthwhile against a China or a Russia.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And thank both of you all for your service. I appreciate very much you being here today. Secretary Esper, I support the wall, and I always supported the wall. But I really have a problem with the funding, which I think you all know our position on should be appropriated by us, and that's our job. The reprogramming of the $3.8 billion of appropriated funds to support the border wall, and the reason it troubles me is that $1.3 billion of that is taken out of the National Guard and the reserve equipment. And the National Guard is every one of us have an affinity with our National Guards. So how do we justify the disproportionate cuts to the Guard despite knowing the vital and ever-growing role in aspects of national security? I know about Homeland Security, but the Guards are frontline in defense and Homeland Security.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think with regard to your first remark, we would agree. Our preference would be that this be funded through DHS.
Right.
But that said, we are where we are, and DOD will support DHS in this regard. And as I was saying to Senator Jones, when we try to find a clear line, objective line by which to draw the sources, we came up with the one with regard to either early to need or excess to need. And as things popped out, it became obvious that the impact would be on the National Guard. It's no pleasure for me to have to make that decision as a former Guardsman myself, but we tried to not play.
Well, you know, also, Secretary, you had said that your night court program has been very successful at freeing up money. Could nothing be freed up there on the night court?
Well, I spent 22 sessions over 4 months, and we found $5.7 billion out of a 99 to free up. We started again this year, so I did find 5.7 to put into our NDS priorities, Senator.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I would just say, since the tags and the governors are so intertwined, had they had any forewarning of this whatsoever?
No, sir. The only forewarnings went out were the consultations I had with the service secretaries and the chairman had with General Langell and the service chiefs.
Another question is, I've just been briefed on the Afghan fighting that's going on and our attacks from, is it today? I think the 4th. I just got briefed on that. Maybe you could bring me up to where we are in Afghanistan with the Taliban right now. Also, the peace agreement, you think it might hold because it hasn't held very long? And what direction, what do I tell West Virginians and people that have been upset about the promise of releasing 5,000 enemy fighters? That did not go over well in the state of West Virginia.
Sir, I'm not sure I can do it justice in 2 minutes and 12 seconds, but I'll say this much. It's my view, and I'll let the chairman, I'll save time for the chairman to speak, but my view is the best, if not only path forward is through a political agreement. We have an historic opportunity here. We signed on Saturday in Qatar. I was in Kabul at the same time. This agreement that lays out a framework by which we could proceed toward an eventual intra-Afghan negotiation. It's supposed to happen at this point 5 days from now. And the results so far have been mixed.
What kind of signals we get today? I'm pleased to see at least we supported and defended the Afghan fighters. We didn't just leave them.
Which is allowed us under the document, under the agreement, to defend them. And it's the commitment I made to the Afghans when I was there on Saturday. Right. We will continue to defend the Afghans, support them. The Taliban, are honoring their peace in terms of not attacking U.S. and coalition forces, but not in terms of sustaining the reduction in violence. Our special envoy is over there now. He's going to pulling the parties back together. The critical thing in the next 5 days, few days, will be getting the conditions set for them to sit down with regard to negotiations.
Do we see any retreat whatsoever once we hit the Taliban today from their aggressiveness against the Afghan fighters?
You know, the chairman and I spoke to General Miller earlier on this. Do you want to comment?
Yes, Senator. Bottom line is there was a variety of attacks over the last 24 to 48 hours. They're all beaten back. They're at small little outposts. We did use U.S. air in support of our Afghan allies. What is important, though, for the agreement, we're on day 4. This was small, low-level attacks out on checkpoints, et cetera. But the Taliban have signed up to a whole series of conditions, of which I believe the committee and all members of Congress have all the documents associated with this agreement. You can go through all of it. And of significance, there's no attacks in 34 provincial capitals. There's no attacks in Kabul. There's no high-profile attacks. There's no suicide bombers. There's no vehicle-borne suicide. No attack against U.S. forces. No attack against coalition. There's a whole laundry list of these things that aren't happening. Yes, there were significant numbers of attacks, small attacks. They're all beaten back. And we will continue to
We've seen that they've been able to control their field fighters, right?
We saw that over the 7 days where they were able to go from a high of about 125 attacks a day down to about 15 a day. They issued out instructions not to attack. That's correct.
So we don't know what caused this.
Well, keeping that group of people on board is a challenge. They got their range of hardliners and softliners, and so they're wrestling with that too, I think. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for being here. General Milley, I want to address, and both of you actually on this thing, you mentioned ISR just now, and I agree 100%. One of those perfect examples, I want to lead into my question about asset allocation, is JSTAR is going to ABMS and then the JDC2 development. This is a lot of moving parts very rapidly, and I'm shocked at really the progress we've made in the last year. I know we're not in a classified environment. I'm not going to go there. I want to know, first, Secretary, if you don't mind, the allocation of resources. After we take about 14 or 15% for overhead in the DOD, What's remaining after that, we allocate almost a third, a third, a third. Is that consistent with the NDS refocus on the maritime that General Mattis talked about back in 16 or 17 relative to standing up to our major competitor, China?
Yes, sir. First of all, it's not cleanly a third and third and third. There's a traditional background. Normally, Navy has the highest, Army usually has the lowest, Air Force in between, and there's a lot of different things
Actually, I'm sorry to correct, but the 21 budget, Army and Navy are almost equal.
No, sir. They're quite different.
Okay, well, we'll take that offline, but
Okay.
I'd like to see that because the numbers I have are a little bit different.
The Navy's at 207 billion, and the Army at 177.
Okay, go ahead.
Anyways, that said, that is where it is. As the chairman and I have talked about this, we've talked about it with the chain of command. What we need to do, I think, is first of all update our war plans. They haven't been updated, and have op plans that are relevant in the post-NDS environment, number one. Number two, and the chairman's working on this, we need a new joint warfighting concept that takes into account all domains of warfare. The Joint Staff is working on that right now. I think once we have updated war plans, and we have a new warfighting concept, and we have a good sense of what future systems will look like, I do think we need to look at that reallocation. But to kind of scramble it up right now, I think would be premature.
And that's a great characterization. I accept that. I have all the respect in the world for you too, and I'm not questioning your authority at all. I know this is a moving target right now. Mm-hmm. The shipbuilding plan, though, was due with the budget. I know it's on your desk, and I know that I think I understand all the reasons why it's a tough decision. You've got the Columbia-class requirement sitting right there as the #1 priority. I wouldn't argue with that at all. Mm-hmm. That's going to be about 25%, in some years as much as 30+% of the total shipbuilding budget. But I want to highlight some numbers that are just shocking today. I mean, today China has about 345, I think these numbers are correct, 345 surface ships, ours to 295. Over the next 15 years, their plan right now, based on what we're seeing publicly, is they're taking it to 435, and we have a 355 plan that comes from 16. Is the 355 consistent with the NDS? And secondarily, is that being looked at seriously in the shipbuilding, the 30-year shipbuilding plan that we're going to see when it comes out of your office?
Well, on the plan, I think the Navy is going to brief me sometime in the next few days on what their proposal is with regard to the plan. With regard to the number, I'll echo what the CNO says. The CNO says 355 is a number, but we need to look at effects and capabilities. But if you want to stick to the number, my gut feeling is we need more than 355, not just to deliver effects, but we need presence.
But is that a function of lethality as well? And given we're not hamstrung by INF anymore, and with ranges and new capabilities that we're also developing?
I think as I've laid out my plan, my thinking, because we're going to run some internal war games to look at a range of options. Navy has some ideas, CAPE has some ideas, some think tanks have done some good work. I think some core principles we worked around is we have to have more ships but smaller. We need to have, I believe, more attack submarines. We need to move more quickly into unmanned. And in all cases, we need to have distributed sensors and shooters. We need to have the ability to be survivable in this environment. And there are a number of other things. But again, I was just meeting with the CNO and the acting secretary yesterday on this. But we agree that lethality is critical at range. But for the Navy, it's also presence. You have to have enough surface combatants available at any one time to have a presence to show U.S. assurance, deterrence, et cetera, which is why my instinct is that we need more than 355.
Well, we have many more combatant commanding areas that, other than the Indo-Pacific, that we are responsible for today.
Yes, there are many responsibilities, whether it's counter-drug or maintaining freedom of the seas and all that. We have the world's greatest Navy, and we need to keep it that way.
General Milley, going to one other thing, we're talking about finding every $1 billion around. You've railed about this, and I have too, so has the Secretary. You got 23 seconds. Go after CRs. Tell us exactly what continuing resolution, 12 of the last 13 years, we've hamstrung the military with a continuing resolution for at least the first quarter of the fiscal year. We're in the 6th month of our fiscal year. We haven't even started this process yet. So we're facing down another CR this year. It'll be the 13th in 14 years. Mm-hmm. And so we are estimating now, your service directors, surface commanders have told us that roughly in aggregate, it's about $5 billion per quarter.
Per quarter.
Per quarter.
Lost buying power.
General Milley, tell us how it really affects our readiness and our recapitalization efforts. That's over 10 years, $50 billion. I mean, that takes care of a lot of these long-term shipbuilding issues that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm already over time and I haven't even started. But
no, you go, sir.
I would just tell you that it's a very ineffective, inefficient way of managing the taxpayers' money because industry can't rely on a steady cash flow and stream and predictability in industry. And then we, in terms of programming and acquisition, et cetera, our program managers can't rely on steady billing as well. So it's a very inefficient way. We're budgeting basically 9 out of 12 months or 6 out of 12 months of a year, and that's just no way to run a railroad station. It's just not a good way to do it.
Well, thank you.
CRs are not good.
I do.
Yes, sir.
Just a quick follow-up. One thing that the DOD is going to come with you soon, Senator, is a legislative provision. Other departments of the federal government have it. It would seek legislative authority to transfer any expired Navy funds, which otherwise would go back to Treasury, back into the SCN account. Our conservative estimate is this would free up another $1 billion a year that we can go back and put back into shipbuilding. Otherwise, it goes back into the Treasury. And it would be money that you've already appropriated and authorized to us for this purpose.
I wanted the chairman for one last comment on this. We're working with OMB too, and I think there are opportunities in there where we'll give you some freedom, and our appropriators to give you some freedom within the current rules that they've never envisioned before because they never realized how expensive this is, to give you some latitude that when you are in a CR, you're not as hamstrung as you are today. But I agree with General Milley. This is an absolute travesty.
Particularly important for the shipyards.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our two witnesses, to the chairman and the secretary. I appreciate each of your service. Testimony today has been about this budget being directed toward the National Defense Strategy. General Milley said about something, why would I purchase something not aligned with the National Defense Strategy? And we've also heard in an era of tight budget. So where in the National Defense Strategy is there a phrase, a border wall on America's southern border?
Senator, there's Homeland Security is in the National Defense Strategy.
It is, but is there a mention of a border wall on the southern border?
I don't believe so, but nor is there a
right.
mention of dealing with floods and putting out wildfires and
Right.
helping people with
I just
hurricanes.
read the NDS, and you're talking about this is a budget that is focused on the NDS. The National Defense Strategy has a 14-page synopsis. The border wall on the southern border is not mentioned. The southern border of the United States is not mentioned. There's one mention of a border in the 14-page public synopsis, and it is this: Russia has violated the borders of other nations. So when you come and tell me that this is focused on the NDS, I got a real problem with that. And I know that that's maybe above decisions or other people's decisions, but $6 billion came out of the Pentagon's budget last year, 3.5 for MILCON and 2.5 coming to the into the counter drug fund and then into the border wall. You have done a reprogramming, I believe, of 3.9. There have been earlier questions about that, 3.8 into this counter drug fund. There's also been a report in the Washington Post that there's another shoe to drop, and about $3.7 billion is likely to be taken out of MILCON. Is that accurate, or should we expect to see that?
That is not an accurate number, but that is a possibility that could happen, yes, Senator.
So the number may not be accurate, but is it likely that we're going to see another tranche taken out of MILCON?
We could. I don't want to put an estimate on it at this point in time.
So, I mean, it's just, I can't imagine a scenario in which this committee, I'll just say it bluntly, would allow a Democratic president to take money out of the defense budget to use for a non-defense priority. I cannot imagine it. I appreciate, Secretary Esper, that you, in response to Senator Manchin, said the preferred way would be to have a tough appropriations battle, appropriate money for the border wall, and then spend the money appropriated for the DOD within DOD accounts. I think that makes perfect sense. But, you know, it's hard for you to look us in the eye and say this is very focused on the NDS when I can't find mention of the border wall or the border in the NDS. And when earlier witnesses have testified, though this be an emergency, it's not a military emergency. Let me dig into another issue. When you do, just using the 3.8 figure, you do that transfer within the DOD into the counter-drug fund and then use that for the wall. Is that transfer subject to the transfer authority that we give you, where there's a general transfer authority in the Appropriations Act where you can transfer up to $4 billion a year within DOD accounts with notice to Congress but without approval? Is that 3.8 transfer within that $4 billion transfer authority?
I think so, Senator, but I'd want to come back with you to affirm it.
I'd love that, but my belief that it is too. So you have $4 billion of transfer authority. We're a few months into the fiscal year. It's often the case that transfer authorities are most needed at the end of the fiscal year, and you've used $3.8 billion of the transfer authority by the beginning of March, when we have a whole lot of months left in the fiscal year. So, for example, how much in the president's budget for DOD is coronavirus response if we need to maintain people in place on South Korean bases and on bases in Italy, bases in Germany, bases in other places around the world, our troops and our families? It's probably not in the PB, but that would be the kind of thing for which we give you transfer authority. But you've now almost bumped up against the limit of your transfer authority out of that $4 billion to build money at the wall, and we still have, 8 months left in the fiscal year. Isn't that right?
Your assessment is correct, Senator.
Would it make your job easier if we eliminated your transfer authority and said any transfer authority you had to come to us for permission? The $4 billion, you can do it without our permission. Over $4 billion, you have to get our permission. If we had said you can't do any transfers without Congress's position, would that actually help you? Because it would enable us to say, you got to get it through appropriations. If you want something for a wall, if you want to fight climate change, if you want to fight gun violence, you got to get it through appropriations. Because if you had to come back to us to ask for authority to do that $4 billion transfer, then we could actually keep the money in the budget that is directed toward the National Defense Strategy.
Senator, there's no head of any organization that wants his or her hands tied by narrowing the options. You always want to expand your options in your maneuver space, so no, not necessarily.
But in an odd way, aren't your hands kind of tied in this way? I mean, if money can be taken out of your budget to use for DHS or to battle climate change or gun violence, if it can be taken out of your hands, that's sort of a tying of your hands in terms of putting together a budget that promotes the National Defense Strategy, isn't it?
Senator, I recognize what you're saying. Like I said, the President has declared a national emergency. We've been tasked to support DHS, and if it's legally available, we intend to support DHS.
I appreciate your answers. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you again, Secretary Esper and General Milley. I want to talk about the killing of terrorist leader Qasem Soleimani. It's been about 2 months. I agreed with that important decision to take out that terrorist leader who has a lot of American blood on his hands. Despite the ridiculous politicizing that we saw at the time, people almost cheering that we were about to go to war with Iran. Unfortunately, it should have been a unifying issue. It's now been 2 months. Can you share at all what you've seen? I believe that was a body blow. We heard from you and others that it was a body blow, the impact that that's having on Iran's terrorist activities, their threats in the region, their proxy forces, and the threat to us and Israel?
I think, Senator, that as you well know, Soleimani, was a terrorist leader of a terrorist organization who killed many, many Americans, wounded thousands more, killed his own people, killed people throughout the region. Very capable adversary. But I think it's clear that taking him off the battlefield has set back the IRGC and the Iranian government with regard to spreading their malign activity throughout the region. I think by the same action, we have restored deterrence to a degree. And so for all those things, I still believe it was the right call made by the Commander-in-Chief.
As do I. Thanks. General Milley, you got anything to add to that?
I would add that absolutely think it was the right call. And I second the idea that we reestablish deterrence. Exactly. I think that's really critical, and we can talk about that in a classified form, exactly what makes me believe that. But I do believe that's been reestablished.
Thanks. Staying on Iran, the reports of coronavirus there, again, another totalitarian, opaque country. I don't believe anything they're reporting or the way they're going to handle it. But there's been reports that 23 members of parliament, 10% of the parliament, a senior advisor to the supreme leader, vice president, deputy health minister, all contracted the virus. Are you seeing anything related to the impact, especially with Iraq, with our forces in the region, or how that may further put pressure on the regime, both internally from their own people as they are failing to deal with this?
I think that Senator becomes a factor, obviously, as we see this unfold. Authoritarian countries having a problem with transparency and being forthright with their folks. Quite honestly, though, my attention has been focused on the three priorities I've been outlining internally to my commanders. One is protection of our force, our service members and their families. Number two, safeguarding our mission capability. And number three, supporting the interagency.
Great. Thank you. I want to totally change topics here on military sexual assault. So last year, I worked with your predecessors and I championed reforms that made it into the NDAA, specifically focused on improving the process from a report forward, the investigative process and the support going forward after a report has been made. When I went to Yuma in Arizona, I had heard that they had no special victims counsel there full-time, that oftentimes victims were waiting a significant amount of time before they got to meet with an SVC, which they often wanted before their first meeting with investigators. So I put in the bill that they needed to have an SVC available within 72 hours, every single victim. We now have a full-time one at Yuma, for example, but we're seeing this all over the country now. And victims are able to get their special victims counsel quicker and have a more immediate response. We're also hearing other reports of just increases to NCIS and how that's having a positive impact. So just a question, given the successes, we still need to prioritize implementation of those provisions. Can you report back to me on anything else you're seeing in the field and the implementation?
Yes, ma'am. First of all, your efforts and assistance in establishing the Sexual Assault Accountability Investigative Task Force are directly helping service members. We have a lot of good information data so far, both factually and anecdotally. The department has approved all 22 recommendations in the 4 critical focus areas. They are all now policy, which I'm pleased to report, and we're in the process of implementation across the board. And the task force continues to meet the track implementation. So a lot of this is moving on. It's critical to reducing timelines for cases and ensuring the best evidence for consideration. And I'd love to come back or send a team up to update you, but it's always seems to be moving in the right direction generally, and it's having an impact.
Great, thanks. And the next thing we want to now focus on, obviously, is prevention, stopping these crimes from happening in the first place. And we've talked extensively about this. I don't know, General Milley, if you want to pipe in and, in your long experience in the military, how we get to the front end and preventing these crimes from happening in the age groups where it's happening. We know exactly what we need to get after, but what we've been doing for training and prevention is just not working.
I want to thank you for your personal leadership, but the key here is the chain of command and commanders and non-commissioned officers, starting at the senior levels, but also going all the way down to team sergeants and team leaders and first-line supervisors. And everyone is, as Sergeant Major of the Army used to say, not in my squad sort of thing, or not in my squadron, or not in my battalion. This takes ownership, and you have to embrace it completely. And it's a function of good order and discipline of the force, for which commanders and commanders alone are personally responsible and should be held accountable for the good order and discipline of their force, regardless of whether it's sexual assault or drugs or crimes of violence or whatever it is. The key here to success is commanders.
Thanks. I'm over my time. I look forward to continuing to working with you on this issue. Thanks.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you both for your service and for being here today. I sent a letter last month along with Senator Murphy to express my frustration that the Navy budget included funding for only one Virginia-class submarine, and reports that you signed off on a decision to shift $1.6 billion in funding from Virginia-class submarine construction to the National Nuclear Security Administration. I'm not here to ask any questions about it because I hope that you continue to believe, as you expressed when you visited Groton the last time you were there, Mr. Secretary, that the undersea warfare superiority of the United States cannot and should not be compromised, that we need to meet the goals for submarine production, and that hopefully 2 Virginia-class submarines for FY 2021 will be accomplished. But I'm concerned also about the delay in delivering the force structure assessment and 30-year shipbuilding plan that apparently is still on your desk or somewhere in the Pentagon for approval. I expect that both will be delivered to Congress and the Navy as soon as possible, both in a classified and unclassified version. I hope that's true. Would you confirm that it is?
Senator, I've been briefed about a week ago on the INFSA, the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment. I have yet to be briefed on the 30-year shipbuilding plan. Of course, they cover different timelines, different horizons. But what I want to do is step back and look at not just one view in terms of the future fleet, but I want to take in a range of views. So I regret that it's late. I don't have a good reason why. But what I want to do is give you a full, good assessment of what I think the future is. And I'll give you a quick note on this. I'm a big believer in the tax subs. I believe it's an advantage we have, a distinct advantage we need to grow, both in terms of capability and capacity. I was very impressed by the trip I had up to Groton. But the numbers I see right in that, in at least the INFSA right now for the tax subs, I think the number needs to be higher. So what I want to do is take a broad look at this in light of an approved op plan, in light of other ideas out there, and make sure that before I sign off on it, albeit late, while it may be late, I want to make sure I get it right, or at least I'm comfortable with it, because I do think we need a bigger fleet, and I think we need to put more emphasis on attack submarines.
Well, you couldn't find a more enthusiastic and passionate supporter of a bigger submarine fleet, and I hope we have an opportunity to discuss that issue
chairman's with me too.
before our markup in May on this committee. I want to shift slightly to a point that's been raised by at least one of my colleagues, Senator Verona, the coronavirus impact on not only our servicemen and women and their families, grave and important as it is, but also on, for example, F-35 production.
Mm-hmm.
Right today, the supply line in Japan was completely shut down. That's just one example of our defense industrial base that could be gravely impaired by coronavirus. And I'd like from you and the chairman an assessment of what the impact is likely to be, what you're doing about it, and what your plans are to be more specific. And by the way, I was disappointed by a report that I saw. I'm not vouching necessarily for its accuracy, that you indicated that American military commanders were warned overseas, quote, not to surprise President Trump on the coronavirus, end quote. So maybe you can respond.
Yes, sir. First of all, I was disappointed by that story as well. It's completely wrong. It's bad reporting at its worst. I've been very clear with my commanders, both privately and publicly. I said this at a press conference at Monday. Our three priorities in this order are protection of our service members and their families. Number two, safeguarding our missions, which could include production. And then number three, support to the interagency. The commanders have all the authorities they need, and I'm providing them resources to make decisions. They've made any number of decisions. I don't think I've had to make one. My one request of them, and the chairman will vouch for this, is if you're going to make a very big decision, a high-profile decision, give me a heads up, because I want to make sure that we're integrated across the interagency, that HHS knows, that state knows, indeed the White House knows, and that Congress knows, because that's what I got to do. I got to make sure we're integrated across. So that was a bad report, completely false. And Chairman, if you want to add anything on that.
Senator, thanks. Two things. One is I was in the VTC. All the secretary said it was to Abrams, General Abrams, over in Korea. All he said was, hey, look, if you're going to make the decision of imposing this emergency declaration that he has authority to do, please give me a heads up so I can make sure everybody here in D.C. is informed. That's all it was. It wasn't any kind of thing where trying to squelch people. So that was a mischaracterization. I read the article, and I was in the thing, and it struck me as very odd. But more importantly is the impact on the military. On the uniformed military, we have a demographic that's different than society at large, young, healthy, fit. To date, we've only got, unless there's some new ones today or something, but the reporting I got as of 24 hours ago is we've got one uniformed member that's come down with it over in Korea, a couple of family members. We're screening lots of people. So in terms of the numbers relative to the whole, very small impact. Secondly is on exercises. There are exercises mostly in Indo-Pacific that we're taking a hard look at. One of the CPXs, for example, at the request of the ROC chairman, was canceled over on the Peninsula of Korea. There's some other exercises that are being looked at, scaled down or canceled or postponed. So there might be some impact on exercises. But broadly speaking, right now, the impact on the uniformed military is very, very minimal break. We are also preparing to help whatever the nation needs, and we've got all kinds of plans, and we're able to support other agencies as necessary and as required by the President and Congress.
To include our medical research institutes, et cetera, we're all hands are in terms of supporting this effort to come up with solutions.
My time has expired. I want to thank you both. I want to suggest respectfully that telling the American people more about those plans, to use your word, would be reassuring. You know, the enemy here really doesn't
it's
seem
panic.
Lack of information.
Lack of information, lack of panic, and
exactly.
And these aren't classified plans, and all that kind of
no reason
stuff.
they
This is
shouldn't
stuff
be.
that we could easily,
It's not like the enemy
no, that's right.
benefits
We
from
could
it.
easily let people know.
Right, completely agree.
Thank you.
Senator Sullivan is going to ask questions now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your exceptional service. I appreciate our meetings yesterday. I think both of you are doing an excellent job for our nation. General Milley, I wanted to just get a little bit more. You have stated publicly, you stated in our classified hearing on the Soleimani strike, which I thought was not only constitutional but in this nation's interest. You mentioned about your duty, how you saw that strike after you read the intel. As we all know, General Soleimani wasn't in Iraq on vacation. He was there targeting the killing of more American service members, which he has a long history of doing. Almost half the service members in Iraq at the time were Alaskan base forces, so this was something that was particularly of interest to me. Can you succinctly say what you've said otherwise, because I think it's very important to hear directly from you, someone with over 35 years of military experience, service your country, about what you thought your duty was after reading the intel?
Well, what I had said publicly, and I reiterated it in classified sessions, was reiterated it in more detail, was I believe the intelligence was compelling. I believe it was imminent. And not only was Soleimani have a long track record going all the way back to the Beirut bombing of being involved in that, but more importantly, his command and control role and what he was about to do. And I believe that I, Secretary Esper, the President, and many, many others would have been culpably negligent had we not taken the action we did, because I think many Americans would have died as a result. So I believe it was the right thing to do then, and I believe it was the right thing to, I still believe that, and I believe we contributed to reestablishing deterrence with aggressive action from Iran.
So I appreciate that. I think reestablishing deterrence anywhere in any theater is actually really hard to do, and you've been able to do it so far, and I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, we had a good discussion yesterday on this issue of the DPRI, and I'd like to get your views. You know, there was language in the NDAA from last year that essentially has the two of you focusing on the DPRI and the issue of, I think the National Defense Strategy is warmly and strongly received here in the Senate in a bipartisan way. But if you look at our force posture, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, it's stale. A lot of it exists really after World War II or the Korean War. How are you thinking about that, and how should we be thinking about that here in the Senate?
Thank you, Senator. I do think we need to take a fresh look at our force posture in the Pacific. By the way, I think we need to take a fresh look at our force posture everywhere, which is why we're doing these COCOM reviews. So I'll be working my way through these to look at just these things. And by the way, we're finding some things already that just don't make sense. But with regard to Indo-PACOM, absolutely, we should think about what it means if we have to face off against China in the year 2035 or 2049. DPRI is one example of something that was developed many, many years ago. And I know it's a little bit tricky. There's a lot of diplomacy involved in this, but I think that's something also we should take a look at to make sure that we are well postured, particularly our Marine capabilities, our Marine forces, to not just be able to respond flexibly, but also be able to train and sustain our forces in the region for an extended period.
Can I dig into that a little bit with you? The issue of training, I think, is a really important one, whether it's on Guam, whether it's other places, Okinawa, for example. We don't get the opportunity to do a lot of training in those places, and I think to have sustainable deployments, but also keeping our forces sharp, we need good training areas. Would you agree with that?
We absolutely. I mean, training is it's the lifeblood of a unit's effectiveness, is ability to train, maintain, and equip their force.
Well, we look forward to working with both of you on that continued important reassessment that you're doing. The other issue that I know I've been raising quite a long time, Mr. Secretary, you might remember in your confirmation hearing, you mentioned that if the Air Force in its upcoming OCONUS decision on where to place the next squadrons of KC-46s did it in an area that was co-located with over 100 fifth-generation fighters, that it would provide the United States with extreme strategic reach, and it would show that to our potential adversaries. The TRANSCOM commander testified last week that one of the most stress-capable aspects in their #1 readiness concern was the air refueling fleet. My question to him and to you and the Secretary of the Air Force yesterday, having a deployment of KC-46s in the Oconus bed down in an area that can reach multiple COCOMs, like a place like Alaska with the 105th Gen fighters, from your perspective, what message does that additionally send to our adversaries? You've already talked about the issue of extreme strategic reach when I asked that question earlier.
Well, I do think, I think two critical needs for our forces right now are to have that strategic lift, refueling, and sea lift, by the way. But the location of Alaska gives you great reach in terms of whether you go across the pole into Russia or toward China. When you couple it up with the amalgamation of forces, it does put the enemy in a different posture. Your adversary is in a different posture because you now have that reach, that lethality at hand and ready to do what it might need to do if called upon.
Great. Thank you very much.
Senator, if I might, I
General,
also
please.
don't want any adversary to walk away thinking that the United States of America cannot project power because of a stress on the tanker fleet. We can, and they should have no doubt about it. Yes, we're giving up 10 KC-10s and 13 KC-135s, but we still have almost 500. We can get there firstest with the mostest, and no one should doubt that.
But certainly one of the best ways to relieve the stress is to have tankers in places that can reach several COCOMs.
But we can get there.
Thank you.
I don't want anybody to think we can't.
Thank you. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. I appreciate it.
I know you're going to ask a question on the Arctic. So
I am, as a matter of fact.
Excellent.
You left it for me. Secretary Esper, first I want to thank you personally for the participation of the department in the National Cyber Solarium process. Over a year, we've worked very hard. Ken Rapuano and David Norquist made significant contributions in intellectual firepower and criticism and thoughtfulness, and I just want to thank you for your authorization for that participation. It was very meaningful.
Thank you, Senator. I'm very encouraged by that, by all that too. It's there's a lot good coming out of it.
Well, we'll be releasing our report next Wednesday, as a matter of fact. And,
great.
And I think it's a good piece of work. And indeed, we've spent a whole session here and really haven't talked about cyber, which is an essential. That's not the right word. A very real domain of warfare today, and that's what we'll be talking about extensively next week. So I just wanted to thank you.
Thanks. And we're in cyber competition, if not conflict, every single day.
Exactly. We're at war today.
Yes, sir.
General Milley, I guess this is a question for both of you. I'm very concerned about a gap in defense against hypersonic weapons. Both of our principal adversaries, China and Russia, have developed these weapons, have actually deployed them, and this puts at risk particularly our naval resources. Talk to me about what we're doing to counter that threat.
Senator, as part of our hypersonics research, we are putting money into defensive systems. One of the early things that we know we need that money is going directly into is a low Earth orbit missile tracking system, if you will, that would be able to track hypersonic systems moving through the atmosphere.
Because one of the problems with hypersonics is they don't leave a radar signal. They move so fast they create a plasma shield. So we need the tracking.
You need a low. We've determined that you need a LEO tracking system to do that. So that's one of the priorities of our R&E efforts to do that. And then, of course, you have to figure out the effectors by which you would knock one out of the sky, if you want, or a variety of things that we're exploring. But it is critical to have that defense because it is such the maneuverability, the speed, the effectiveness of these systems is remarkable.
Two things, yes, Senator King, on that. One, on the defense, if you can be seen, you can be hit. And there is no defense against hypersonic. It goes 5 to 10 times the speed of sound. You're not going to defend against it. So what you have to do is be invisible. And there's all kinds of techniques and procedures that we're working on in order to make our forces very difficult to see from an acquisition standpoint of enemy radar. So that's on the defense. On the other part, you're not going to shoot the arrow. Those things going so fast, you're not going to get it. Right. You got to shoot the archer. You got to go deep downtown, and you got to get on the offense. If you want to defeat hypersonics, you got to go to the source, the launch pads,
and you have to have the ISR in order.
That's right. You got to have the ISR to get in there. And if you're launching hypersonics at the United States, then you're going to war with the United States, and you're going to pour it on with mass and firepower and fast and hard.
But I thought you made an important point earlier in the hearing where you talked about ISR. We've sort of had a vacation on ISR.
That's right.
Because we've been acting against enemies that don't have any air capacity. It's a whole different ballgame when we're talking about peer state competitors.
That's right. And you want to invest in ISR that can penetrate the airspace of these great power competitors.
It's also why we talk, as I've laid out the shipbuilding principles, if you will, going forward, is and the Navy agrees with this, is a move away from very large platforms into smaller platforms, a more distributed force, so that you complicate the enemy's plans, particularly with regard to the employment of hypersonics.
Well, you raised shipbuilding. We talk about the Indo-Pacific as being the most important region. We talk about the national defense strategy, and yet the budget talks about knocking out 4 destroyers and I think an amphib in the future plan. How was that decision made? How firm is it? Can we revisit it? I want to get a little bit of thoughts on that. By the way, the other thought is, we're doing this recapitalization out of operating costs. In any other organization, you'd have a capital budget, and you're building 40-year an asset. A Columbia submarine is a 40-year asset, and yet we're building them out of cash flow instead of some kind of long-range attributed to the cost over the life of the object. To get back, talk to me about the shipbuilding.
Well, as I said earlier, I think we need, to me, I don't focus as much on the number, but that number 355 is out there. I think we need to have a fleet larger than 355. My gut tells me that. I'm convinced of that.
Senator Perdue had a chart this morning at the Sea Power Subcommittee that if you saw it, it shows what China's doing, you'd feel vindicated.
Yes, sir. But we do have a qualitative capability over them. There's some other things out there.
Sure.
But nonetheless, if it's not just capability and lethality, it's presence. You have to have the presence. And so I do think we need to get on that path. I think there are a number of things that we need to do. First of all, I completely support what the CNO did. The CNO decided to reallocate $4 billion or so out of SCN and put it into O&M to get readiness up. We have a readiness challenge. It's been well documented.
The ship's no good if it's in the dock.
Yes, sir. And I think the GAO said last year in 2019, due to maintenance challenges, the equivalent of 19 ships didn't go to sea. And so we got to fix the readiness challenge and then put more money into shipbuilding. If we can get the legislative approval changed, Secretary Milley's digging in deep. He's doing what the Army and Air Force did to find $40 billion over 5 years. That'll free up a good chunk of what they think they need. And then we got to get this higher top line moving in the right direction.
Well, but we also have to, what worries me about what you're talking about, and I'm sorry I know I'm over time, but I worry about you can't turn the industrial base off and on with a switch. And if we drive it down and you have a loss of personnel, loss of welders, loss of skilled shipbuilders in Bath, Maine, or Pascagoula, or Marinette, Wisconsin, you can't turn them back on.
Completely agree, Senator. That's why I think we need to look more, particularly with large capital investments like ships, multi-year, and even I think the Navy we discussed yesterday is can you multi-year O&M so that you don't have the same perturbations in your maintenance cycle, right? Because you can't afford to go, take a ship out of maintenance and then have a month or 2 month gap. And I know they're struggling with this up in Groton right now with the with the maintenance up there. So you got to figure out a way to smooth that out so workers will be incentivized to stay in the trade.
Are you suggesting that consistent funding from Congress might be a benefit? I'm shocked.
Consistent and timely.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper General, thank you for being here. Thank you for your service. Mr. Secretary, let me start with you. In your confirmation testimony last summer, you wrote that we needed a distributed and resilient force posture in the Indo-Pacific. I'm concerned about the concentration of our forces currently in Japan and South Korea. Give me your assessment about our ability to compete effectively with China given that concentration.
Yes, sir. Well, those forces that are there for, for a variety of reasons. I think Senator Sullivan mentioned it. We have a presence that largely reflects where we've been for many, many years. And so I do think we need to step back and look at that. I know Admiral Davidson is looking at that to make sure we have more distribution. I'm trying to get out there. I've traveled to the Indo-PACOM 2 or 3 times now to visit non-traditional partners. I've been from Mongolia to Vietnam. I'll be going to Indonesia. I think there's much more ground we can cover and to build more relationships with more countries.
You anticipate my next question, which is whether we can disperse U.S. forces to other locations in the Pacific to improve survivability and reduce risk to operations. You think that we can?
Improve survivability, but also grow more partners and more people in terms of standing up and telling the Chinese they have to obey the international rules of order and abide by that. That's going to take a lot of investment. So
What investment do we need to be able to disperse our forces along those lines?
Well, I think we need to think creatively, Senator, about, as you think through the war plans, how we might fight in the future, is where do we need to be? Does it require MILCON? Does it require, the chairman and I are big believers in IMET, so get more countries from the Indo-Pacific, even non-traditional partners, into our schoolhouses, grow that relationship over a career. There are a number of things that we should do that, by the way, the DOD is doing. We're committed to a 50% growth in IMET over 5 years.
Just sticking with the question of investment, at your confirmation hearing, you said that you were open in principle to using something like EDI to accelerate investment in Indo-PACOM. I don't see anything like that, however, in your budget. Why is that?
The more I think about that, I mean, we've discussed this a lot. Sometimes I get concerned if you bucket a certain amount of money for a certain region, it can be both limiting and, in other words, if you put so much money in there, people say that's it and that's all you need, or you get trapped by that fund. And I actually appreciate the flexibility of putting more or less in depending on how circumstances change. But clearly, I think, and we're talking to the commander out there about what are your investment plans, focusing them more in terms of future presence, what do we need to do, where do we need to grow relationships.
EDI has been so successful in that theater and for our needs there. I continue to believe that something like that mechanism.
The only thing I'd say, Senator, is sometimes it takes the pressure off of countries to invest their own dollars into supporting us and providing host nation support, because they see that fund out there and they go after that instead of going to their parliaments and saying, how can we support the U.S. presence?
I just want to make sure that we are getting the resources we need to what is our priority theater, I believe, under the NDS, in a timely fashion if we're going to be postured successfully. I mean, we're behind the curve, I think.
I'm impatient. I think we can and should do more. That's why I'm trying to do these COCOM reviews to free up time, money, and manpower to invest more into that future fight.
I applaud your COCOM reviews, by the way, and let's talk for a second about AFRICOM. The AFRICOM Commander General Townsend recently testified that he thought our European allies could send more forces to West Africa and take over some of the missions currently being done by our forces, like airlift, for instance, and aerial refueling.
Sure.
Do you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely, and I've talked to the allies about this, and we've talked a few times about aerial refueling. We provide that to the French for free, if you will, and that's one of the areas where I've talked to the French to say, look, I'm having a problem with air refuelers right now. If somebody else can pick up that mission, that helps us all out a lot. That's part of the review, is looking at how do we do the same mission but maybe do it differently.
Yeah. Well, this seems to me like a clear situation where we can and should expect our allies to do more. And again, I applaud your COCOM reviews. General Milley, let me switch topics. Let's talk about Iran. If Iran resumes provocations in coming months, what is your assessment of how many troops we can send to that theater without risking our situation in Indo-PACOM, without undermining deterrence, if you like, in the Indo-Pacific?
I don't think I could answer that in an open session. I'd rather come back to you in a classified session, point one. Point two, just to be clear, though, there is a significant amount of force in Indo-Pacific. 300,000 troops, 7 aircraft carriers. I mean, there's a lot of force in the Pacific. And in Central Command, you're looking at about 70,000 troops currently, right now. There's an adequate amount of force in Central Command to maintain deterrence. If deterrence breaks down, we'll analyze the situation, and we'll do whatever's required to achieve whatever national security objectives are necessary relative to Iran. And I'd rather get back to you in a classified session on exactly what that would be.
You bet. I'll pursue that with you in a classified setting. My last question on this, Mr. Chairman, is just your comments about the relative balance between CENTCOM and PACOM. Is it your sense that there's a little bit of slack then, General, in Indo-PACOM? I mean, is that, am I reading?
Well, I mean, again, it depends. I mean, if you think that, you're close to a war with Korea or China, then probably not. But so it depends on what the situation is in Indo-PACOM at the moment in time. We will do whatever is required to achieve U.S. national security interests, no matter where it's at in the world. And if something were to happen very significantly more than what's current in the Middle East, then decisions will be made by the President and Secretary of Defense to move the right amount of forces to achieve our objectives.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. On behalf of the Chairman, let me recognize Senator Peters.
Thank you, Ranking Member Reed, and to our both the gentlemen. Thank you for testimony here today and your service. Secretary Esper, briefly, I'd like to discuss prescription drug prices under TRICARE. This is an issue that Senator Rounds and I have been working on, along with some of the other members of the committee here. This committee previously authorized a pilot program that would lower the cost of prescription drugs for TRICARE beneficiaries including service members, their families, and our military retirees. I know that the department has begun the process of preparing for this prescription drug parity pilot program, but it still has not begun. So my question is, can you commit to working with us on action to lower the cost of prescription drugs for our service members under TRICARE, and particularly expanding their opportunities to purchase these drugs?
Yes, sir. Without having too much detail, I'm always committed to improving quality and access.
Great. Secretary Esper, last week, Senator Cotton and I sent a letter urging you to establish a U.S.-Israel Operations Technology Working Group. This group would coordinate and catalyze military research and development efforts between the United States and Israel, focusing on the shared threats that our countries face and capitalizing on clearly the world's leading national security innovation base in both countries, both the U.S. and Israel. So this is to both Secretary Esper and General Milley. What is your view on enhancing the security cooperation with Israel, particularly in the areas of technology research and development? How can we strengthen that between our two countries?
Senator, without having seen your letter yet, I would tell you that we have a very good innovative base. They have a very good innovative base, and I think the more we can cooperate together as allies and partners to come up with common solutions, the better. We do a lot of work with them now on a number of things. Certainly at the industrial level, they compete too against and with American companies. So I think if there are ways to improve that, we should pursue it.
And we as you know, we work very closely with Israel in a lot of areas, and specifically in R&D and S&T and combat developments. For example, we have the active protective system on our armored vehicles. That's an Israeli-produced system. We've looked at the Arrow for our ballistic missile defense system, and a wide variety of other systems. So there's an exchange of ideas and knowledge, research, development between us and Israelis on a regular basis.
Secretary Esper, on February 24th of this year, the DoD officially adopted a series of ethical principles for the military use of artificial intelligence. The principles were designed to complement existing ethical frameworks, and you structured the ethical framework around 5 specific areas for military use of AI: responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. I've had long-standing concerns about the consequences of the United States and our allies adopting ethical standards without similar and equitable standards being adopted by our competitors and adversaries that operate under a different framework than we do. My question is the U.S. placed at a competitive disadvantage at the tactical and operational level by adopting AI ethical standards not shared by our adversaries? And if so, how do we compensate for that disadvantage?
Yes, Senator. First of all, it's a lot of good work done by the Defense Industrial Board with a lot of outreach to a wide range of persons and organizations to develop these. I was briefed on them. I had a number of discussions with a lot of leaders about them. But look, I think this is an area where we lead. And I think the principles, from what I've read and studied and learned, I think they put us in a leadership position. So I think we're establishing the standard, if you will, and I think it will make us better. And the more we can get other countries to come on board and align themselves to those, the better.
In the past, the U.S. has successfully used international agreements and arms control treaties to provide some stability, particularly with emerging technologies, and in the attempt to minimize potential catastrophic mistakes that could occur. In terms of AR, are we at a stage where AI requires the equivalent of an arms control treaty to ensure the current rules-based international order? And if so, how would that look?
It's a good question, Senator. I'd have to think about it and get back to you and consult with people, and I just don't know. It's not something I would take off the table, but it's a fair question. Again, I think we want to develop some common standards, if you will, and we try to set the bar by my signing out those AI ethical principles, and to set a high bar from the beginning and urge others to come on board.
General Milley, any thoughts?
I think artificial intelligence, as I've testified before, is sort of the mother of all technologies out there. It's extraordinarily powerful, and there's no doubt in my mind that it's going to be used for military purposes in the not-too-distant future. There's a wide variety of ethical concerns with that. I don't know if arms control agreements are the right mechanism or not, but all countries, not just the United States, are going to have to come to grips with the introduction of artificial intelligence for use in military operations. It is extremely powerful, and it's going to have to be dealt with.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen.
On behalf of the chairman, let me recognize Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank both of the witnesses for appearing before the committee today, and I'd like to follow up on what my colleague, Mr. Hawley, touched on, which is the Indo-Pacific strategy. I feel very strongly that this is a part of the world we need to spend more attention on, and I have heard from both of you your emphasis on Indo-PACOM and our role and the importance of our role there. And while I applaud the department's messaging about prioritizing great power competition in this region over other activities, I do remain concerned that we've not matched our rhetoric with our actions. How are we able to divert some $7 billion to border wall construction, and yet we're not incredibly say that the Pacific region is our main effort? And you know, Secretary Esper, I agree with you that IMED is certainly very important. In fact, I recently met with General Aparits Kosampong, who is the Thai Army leader, and he talked very fondly about all his time that he spent at U.S. training facilities. And in fact, he said it was his joint experience training at U.S. facilities as that of General Andika from Indonesia that led them to form a friendship based on their experience in the U.S. that then led to this recent agreement they just signed 2 months ago on information sharing. But I think it takes more than IMED. I think you need to put some milk on in this. I think we need to look at staffing and resources increasing for the Indo-PACOM in order to really deter Chinese aggression. So I'd love to hear from both of you as to when we're going to see more of a plus-up in this region beyond just talking about how great this is.
Senator, I think first of all, you know, I agree with the importance of Indo-PACOM, and it's because it's number one in our strategy, to say the least. But if you look at the simple disposition of forces, Indo-PACOM has 5 times as many forces as any other theater, over 350,000. The next closest theater is 70,000. If you added up every other theater, Indo-PACOM would still be twice as big as all of them combined. So we have a lot of forces in the theater. I think the challenge isn't necessarily putting more forces in. It's making sure that we look at our disposition on the ground and think, how do we use them more effectively to grow partners and allies, and then how do we exercise with them, et cetera, et cetera. That's my quick assessment.
I don't disagree with you that it's not just about the number of troops that are on the ground. It's about resourcing Indo-PACOM so that they can go out. I think we need to be focused, you know, and you're already talking about this, more basing agreements.
Right.
I was very impressed with what was done in South Korea when we didn't have enough ammunition, and you guys took that out of Hyde and plussed them up. But this is the reason that you have more troops is because it's a larger geographic region than, say, CENTCOM is. Or maybe AFRICOM, we have more geographic area, but the geography is different. General, you were going to say?
Well, you're exactly right. The geography is completely different. The politics are different. The international politics. The threats are different. The allies are different. All of that is different. You have to factor all of that in. But in terms of main effort versus supporting efforts and economy of force efforts, in the NDS, the Central Command area, AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM are all designated as economy of force, and you're familiar with that term from your military experience. And EUCOM is a supporting effort, and PACOM is, quote-unquote, the main effort. It's all part of a globally integrated level of effort with all the resources that the Department of Defense has. With respect to Indo-PACOM, the Secretary mentioned 350,000 troops. He's also got, 200 ships, 7 aircraft carriers. He's got 3 ARG-MUs. He's got 1,600 high-performance aircraft. This is a highly resourced, from a military standpoint, highly resourced theater. So it's not so much the numbers of the ships, planes, trains, and automobiles sort of thing. It's how we use it, where we put it, and what our broader strategy is with respect to what we think is going to be the most significant adversary for the next 100 years, which is China, and the rise of China, how we as a nation deal with that. Military is one aspect of a much broader strategy that we've got to come to grips with. But I do think that Indo-PACOM is well-resourced from a departmental standpoint in terms of military capability right now.
But the Chinese are really moving ahead of us when it comes to basing issues there, and we have to have more than a little toehold there in order to ensure freedom of navigation.
That's
and
right. Access, basing, overflight, all that stuff plays into it.
So adjacent to this issue, I want to shift slightly to the other, if there is a bet on what questions I was going to ask you, I'm sure this is one of the ones we'll come up with, which is logistics. I'm deeply concerned about our ability to transport and sustain our forces overseas, especially in places like Indo-PACOM. Contested logistics is something I believe we need to pay far more attention to. This year's cuts to the tanker fleet and anemic investment in sea lift replacement and maintenance really worry me. Secretary Esper and General Milley, can you tell me how this year's defense budget request preserves or improves our ability to transport and sustain our forces in a contested environment? The days that we're going to be able to send ships full of what we need without our enemy trying to take the ship out are behind us.
Senator, you're exactly right. I don't know if you were here earlier, but I mentioned this. I'm concerned that two important things that often get overlooked because they're not sexy are things like airlift and aerial refueling and strategic sea lift. And, we've invested in 2 surge ships this year, but I've had a lot of conversations with General Lyons. We need to do more, and we need to do more soon. That's why we've talked a few times about the shipbuilding plan, but one of the things the shipbuilding plan doesn't incorporate is strategic lift, sea lift. So I sent a letter to the committees, and I said, when I look at the shipbuilding plan, I think we should factor in strategic sea lift because it also competes for budget dollars, and it's a critical factor. So between that, I'm very concerned about the delays in the KC-46. I had the chance to crawl through one about 2 weeks ago and look at the problems. So we're going to have to look at restoring maybe some 10s, some 135s, so we keep that at least a 479 aircraft going. But it's a very capable airplane. It's just going to take some time. But those are critical things, particularly when you see the distances from CONUS or Alaska all the way into theater, into Indo-PACOM theater. And then forward basing is another way you offset that, of course.
Yeah, and you're right, because it's not just about the sea lift, it's the tanker fleet, as you're mentioning, but it's also fueling.
Yes, ma'am.
We've got to have forward fueling capability. We can't just be shipping our fuel there for every, thing that sucks gas, right?
That's right.
And you're right. We're over time, so I can get you an answer for the record. But
Thank you, John.
you're absolutely right to be concerned about the maritime sea lift. We've given that up as a nation for the most part over the last many years, in the tanker fleet and the airlift fleet. On the tankers, though, I just want to be clear again. We've got almost 500 tankers. So in this budget, there's 10 KC-10s and 13 KC-135s. Yes, there's stress on the force. No question about it. You've heard from General Lyons and others. But at the same time, I don't want people who are watching this, especially in certain countries, to think that the United States of America cannot project power overseas when needed. We can, and we will if required.
Thank you.
Let me thank you for your testimony, and thank you particularly for your service. And on behalf of the Chairman Inhofe, let me call it the adjournment of the hearing. Thank you, gentlemen.